is almost always a dark and stormy night. Rain beating down, a boom of thunder in the background. It is almost always an older building, perhaps a hotel. Well maintained, of course, but still showing the signs of wear from centuries of use. A few establishing shots of the room, close-ups of important objects. We see the body, well-dressed and perfectly posed. Then, we hear a door open, and in walks in the person of the hour, our detective, here to solve the case.
Oh. I was just sleeping. Sorry about that.
Now, if I asked you, my dear viewer, where in the world this might be, you will probably have a very specific place in mind. London, the capital of England, a global cultural center, the culmination of thousands of years of history, and the birthplace of the mystery genre. But why was it this city that sparked one of the biggest genres in media today? My name is Claudia Davis, and today we aim to solve this mystery, the Great London Mystery. Let's get into it. But where do we begin to answer such a seemingly vague question? Well, in order to figure out how fictional detectives came about, we need to figure out how real detectives came about. This led me to the Metropolitan Police Museum in Sidcup to begin our search for the answer. The Metropolitan Police was founded in 1829 by the then Home Secretary Robert Peel, who would eventually become Prime Minister. He founded the Metropolitan Police to replace London's then volunteer disciplinary force, who did little to actually deter or prevent crime. He modeled this new government-organized police force after the French police force, which was the only other organized police force that existed at the time. This led to many London citizens to not like the Metropolitan Police, as, for some reason, many British people at the time did not care for the French. However, the primary reason the people of London did not trust the Metropolitan Police was that they were worried it would become Peel's private military. So, in order to convince people otherwise, Peel made the uniform of the Metropolitan Police blue, a direct contrast to the British military's red uniform, and required that officers were only allowed to carry batons instead of more lethal weapons. While its function was to investigate crimes, it was founded in order to ease the embarrassment of the Metropolitan Police, after constables failed to capture a murderer for over a week when they accidentally discovered his victim's torso in his barn. The man, Daniel Good, was only captured because a citizen recognized him from a newspaper sketch. So, due to the public's backlash about the incompetence of the Metropolitan Police, they created the detective branch to investigate murder, theft, fraud, and corruption. One of these early detectives is Charles Frederick Field, who joined the detective force in 1846 and would eventually become chief of the branch. While the date he became chief is unknown, he retired from the position in 1852. After his retirement, he worked as a private detective, and even used his former title of inspector to aid him when working on a case. He died in 1874 and was buried in Brompton Cemetery, just one of over 200,000 people buried there. On a side note, instead of using the phrase, looking for a needle in a haystack, I will now be using the alternate phrase, looking for Field in the Brompton Cemetery. Field, as an ordinary detective, would most likely not be remembered outside of those whose job it is to research the history of the Metropolitan Police. However, he just so happened to have made a very famous friend, Charles Dickens. Dickens was incredibly fascinated with the police and its development, and as such would join the officers when they did their nightly rounds, which is where he met and got to know Field. Over the years of their friendship, Dickens wrote a few articles mentioning Field, and one where Field was the main protagonist, called On Duty with Inspector Field. More importantly, he also based a character in his work Bleak House on Field, a character called Inspector Bucket, the world's first professional detective character. Interestingly enough, Bleak House itself seems to be wholly tied to the creation and development of the Metropolitan Police and its detective branch. Another character in the book, Mademoiselle Hortense, is based on the first major case of the detective branch, known as the Bermondsey Horror. In 1849, a husband and wife murder the wife's lover, bury his body underneath the floor in their home off Weston and Snowfield Streets, and steal his wealth. They were caught and publicly executed, an event which Charles Dickens himself attended. Now, Inspector Bucket may have been the first detective, but he is certainly not the most famous. That title is held by the world's quote-unquote first consulting detective, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. But if he's not the first, why is he the detective that people still remember today? Well, the answer to that is twofold.
But how do you know about them?
Elementary, my dear Watson.
The way in which the first Sherlock Holmes stories were published, and Britain's Education Act of 1870. The Education Act of 1870 was put in place to help expand and manage Britain's public education system. Specifically, while some public schools that were religious, called voluntary schools, already existed in the United Kingdom, this act built more schools in areas that didn't have one already and put in place school boards to oversee and maintain the new education system. It was passed in response to the campaign by the National Education League, which argued for the benefit of free, required, and secular education. Within the next decade, over 3,000 schools were either started by or integrated into a common education system by the school boards. This act was followed up 2 years later by the Standards of Education Act, which in part expected students to be able to read and write fluently. Because it was now required and free for children to go to school, a lot more people were able and wanted to read. With such an increase in literacy, there was also an increase in the desire for accessible fiction. In came Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who published his first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, as a shilling shocker, meaning it cost 1 Victorian shilling, the equivalent of 5 modern pence today, in a magazine called Beeton's Christmas Annual. The cheap price meant that almost everyone could afford it. For 5 years, from 1887 through 1891, Doyle published his stories in magazines, most notably the Strand magazine. It was only in 1892 that Doyle published a full-length Sherlock Holmes novel, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, a compilation of the previously published stories. Its initial print run sold 14,500 copies, and as of now has sold 60 million. Sherlock Holmes was, and still is, inherently connected to the City of London. So then why do we associate the genre of mystery as a whole with London, instead of just with Sherlock Holmes? Well, that would be because of the Queen of Crime herself, Dame Agatha Christie. However, she did not start as a crime writer, despite always being a fan of the genre. After spending the winter of 1908 in Cairo, Egypt with her mother, she wrote a novel, Snow Upon the Desert, one that was consistently rejected by publishers. The last publisher suggested she try writing a different type of novel, and then reaching back out to publishers then. But that would have to wait, as soon after Christie got married in 1914, right after her husband was enlisted to fight in the First World War. To help with the war effort, Christie joined Britain's Red Cross. She became an apothecary's assistant, learning about dosages and the effects of a multitude of drugs as well as some poisons and the basics of chemistry, teachings that would heavily influence her mystery writing. She wrote her first detective novel during this time in 1916, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, when she was stationed at a hospital in Torquay. It featured her now famous detective Hercule Poirot.
Belgravia, an overseas bank clerk, absconds with fortune.
How much is this fortune?
£90,000.
No.
That's a king's ransom, Poirot.
When it is used to ransom a king, it becomes interesting to Poirot.
An immigrant from Belgium to the United Kingdom after his home country was invaded by Germany in the First World War. He was inspired by actual Belgian immigrants and soldiers that came to Torquay and visited the hospital where Christie was training. However, Poirot himself lived in London, in a place called Whitehaven Mansion, now called Florin Court, right next to the Charterhouse Square campus of the Queen Mary University of London. The Mysterious Affair at Styles was published in 1920, and with it came another contracted 5 novels from Christie. While she had not written her first detective novel in London, many of the rest of her detective novels were. For a few years after the First World War, Christie and her then husband lived in a series of apartments all over London, including 5 Northwark Terrace, before settling in Berkshire. Even after moving out of London, she frequently would visit, staying in hotels such as the Savoy, the Ritz, and Brown's Hotel, the later which claims to be the inspiration for Bertram's Hotel in her novel, At Bertram's Hotel. In addition to At Bertram's Hotel, about 10 of her books were set in London, most notably including Cards on the Table, Lord Edgeworth Dies, and The Secret Adversary. But why was Christie so popular? As cliché as it sounds, it was truly the brilliance of her writing, and more specifically, the revolutionary way in which she wrote her mysteries. To quote Sophie Hannah, a mystery writer, "At the start of each novel, she shows us an apparently impossible situation, and we go mad wondering how can this be happening? Then, slowly, she reveals how the impossible is not only possible, but the only thing that could have happened." A notable way Christie does this is with her preferred way of murder, poisons and toxins. Because of her training, she was able to accurately describe the symptoms and effects of different poisons, which made her plots feel a lot more realistic and believable. Her descriptions were so accurate, in fact, that in 1977, British medical personnel were able to correctly identify a case of thallium poisoning because they had previously read it in her novels and recognized the symptoms. In addition, unlike most classic whodunits of the past, she created characters that were psychologically complex and heavily explored their motivations, especially in her female killers, which before her were exceptionally rare in the genre. However, at the end of the day, she made these characters normal people, showing how anyone could be pushed to murder. As of now, she is one of the world's best-selling authors, right behind Shakespeare, and her works have been translated into over 100 languages. As such, she is many people's first exposure to British culture, and for better or for worse, one cannot separate the England image from Agatha Christie in her works. So, now we have an answer as to why London is historically significant to the mystery genre. But, my dear viewer, the mystery is not over yet, because one question still remains. Why is London still significant to the genre today, despite the genre's global success and reach? Now, I have a confession to make. The mystery genre's connection to London was not my original topic for this project. I ended up changing my topic because of a book I was given for Christmas, Murder in the Family by Cara Hunter. The story itself is written primarily in the form of screenplays, emails, and news articles, all detailing a fictional true crime miniseries attempting to solve the murder of a man named Luke Ryder, a young husband of a wealthy widow and the stepfather to the show's director. While the story and its cast take you all over the world, it is primarily set in London. I will say, I am typically a slow reader, but I read Murder in the Family in 3 days. I just couldn't put it down. So naturally, I went to Dr. Hunter's website to find out who she was and to see what other books she has written. Before becoming an author, Cara Hunter studied English literature in Oxford University, later getting her doctorate in the subject after working for 15 years. During that time, she created the Water of Life initiative, working in the public relations for Guinness, which has provided clean water for over 5 million people in Africa, even just over the last 5 years. Currently, she has written 7 books, Murder in the Family, as well as 6, soon to be 7, following Detective Inspector Adam Foley. Here, I noticed a discrepancy. All of her novels have been set in Oxford, where she currently lives, besides Murder in the Family. So why was it decided that Murder in the Family would be set specifically in London? To answer this question, I went to the source and asked Dr. Hunter herself. Why did you choose London specifically for the main setting of Murder in the Family?
For the main setting, yes. Well, one of the obvious things was that the family in the story are very wealthy. So that's one reason why you might set it in London, because there are some very wealthy neighbourhoods in London, and I chose one of those to set the novel. And also just because a big city has a buzz about it, and I was brought up on the outskirts of London, so I know it quite well. So yes, it was a sort of obvious choice given that the nature of the crime that I was going to be investigating to move it to London.
So kind of with that, is there a reason you specifically chose Campden Hill as the location? Because there are many wealthy parts of London.
Yeah, I suppose it's slightly less well known than some of those other places like Chelsea or Kensington. People are quite aware of those areas. I wanted somewhere that was slightly different and has quite a personality of its own as well. So I went and I did some wandering around like you do, sort of scouting around, looking at the area, and it has an interesting history too, which you'll find out in the book. I include some of the history of the area in the book back when it was nowhere near London, when London was a tiny city, and you actually had green fields between Campden Hill and London, as it was in its own right. So that gave me something extra to work with as well. It was something I could explore in terms of the background of the house, because the house is a very old house that they're living in, and you can imagine at one point it was set among the green fields, but by the time we get to the time of the novel, it's been surrounded by loads and loads of very expensive houses. So that was a nice way of looking at the juxtaposition between the past and the present as well.
Initially, to assist in my research into the history of the Metropolitan Police, I contacted the Metropolitan Police History Society, who put my request for an interview in their newsletter. That is how I came into contact with Hamish Brown.
Hello, my name is Hamish Brown. I'm a retired Scotland Yard Detective Inspector. I served over 30 years with London's Metropolitan Police, and I had, I suppose, a very interesting career where I spent most of it in the criminal investigation department, the detective side. Although I did my fair bit, probably 6 years out of 30, doing the streets at different ranks, so I got experience of both sides of the coin. And I went on to spend a long time on serious crimes such as rape, murder, contract killing. But my life changed quite a bit when I got involved in a crime known as stalking. And I did a lot of work on that. I became an authority, and I'm honoured to say I received a very senior award from the late Queen Elizabeth II, which was Member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, which was presented to me at Buckingham Palace by the then Prince, and now is by the Prince, and now His Majesty King Charles.
While I first reached out to him hoping to learn the history of the Metropolitan Police, our conversation went in a very different direction. It made me realize that as much as we love our fictional detectives, we rarely step back and reflect on what the job actually entails.
Now, I started as a uniformed constable at different ranks on promotion. I returned to uniform duties and then gone back to the CID, which was my choice. That's my specialism, to deal with the more involved and complicated crime. But I think it's got to be said, I and a lot of other people have the utmost respect for the uniformed colleagues. They're there 24 hours a day. They're there dealing with the messy things of the disputes, sometimes involving domestic violence, sometimes dealing with a violent drunk, the punch up in a pub or something like that. They're the one going to car crashes and seeing the most dreadful sights. So every respect for them, and it is important that the uniform understand the CID and the CID understand the uniform side of things. But we've moved on a long way, and with the involvement of DNA, of course fingerprints, computers, and a lot more, there's even more for the police to consider. But what must be remembered, whatever the investigation is, unlike the films which show it all being wrapped up in 45 minutes, it's all very convenient. It's not a bit like that. Police work actually can be very boring and very tedious. But I can tell you something, it's a job well worth doing.
During our conversation, I also asked him if investigating such serious crimes had changed his perception of people, and he shared with me just some of the realities and hardships that officers have to face and deal with.
Yes, no, it's a very fair question. Yes, that's a very fair question about police sensitivity and professionalism. And it isn't just the police, incidentally, it's those in the medical profession, those firefighters who deal with difficult situations, paramedics who go out and deal with awful scenes. And the key thing here is being professional, understanding what you're dealing with, having your job, but appreciating that people have feelings as well. Sometimes, and it's happened in a lot of professions, it has come about where perhaps people have been pushed to one side, not have that sympathy. And I think with maturity and experience, it's probably easier to deal with, because it's easy to be rather, offhand with someone, come across as very hard because you don't know how to deal with the situation. But at the same time, you can't have an officer breaking down in tears when dealing with something pretty awful which they have to get on with. I would say there are two types of issue here. One's the physical one, dealing with that messy situation, which might be a dreadful assault, it might be a car crash, goodness me. That is what you're faced with, and you have to get on with it. The second side is the psychological side. Not only does the officer have to cope themselves, but they might be doing a body identification with the next of kin. They might be having to knock on the door and telling their next of kin their loved one has died, and that is quite trying. So there's going to a scene and dealing with a pretty awful situation, but later dealing with next of kin or relatives or people like that and having to deal there. So both can be very taxing, but for very different reasons.
Now, dear viewer, it should be no surprise to you when I say I love the mystery genre. Making this film has made me reflect why. I came to London with a very specific purpose: to make a documentary. But as any good mystery story does, London threw me twists and turns, both good and bad, that I had to figure out. I learned how to navigate a city on my own, took a metro on my own for the first time, tried a lot of food that I never even thought of trying, and on top of that, picked up a camera with Ernest for the first time in over a decade.
You're studying screenwriting yourself, or?
Technically, no. I'm studying engineering.
Oh, wow.
I love filmmaking. It's always been a hobby. I just haven't had time for it. My friend wanted to look at study abroads, and I found the filmmaking program, and I just kind of applied on a whim, and now I'm making a film.
Fantastic. You go for it. Seriously, you go for it. I've always thought, if you don't follow your dream, you'll just regret it later. You really will. And it'll just be fantastic. Really, really, seriously, go for it. I mean, I never thought I'd be a writer, and that it happened. You can make it happen. It's all about hard work and being in the right place at the right time. So you go for it, definitely.
Well, thank you. I found new friends, and the distance had made me appreciate the relationships I already had so much more. Over the course of my 3 weeks here, I learned to find comfort in the unknown, strength in the uncomfortable, and joy in a constant sea of noise. I've also learned, or more realized, I love mysteries not just for the big reveal in the last chapter, but for the journey it took to get there. And once you have the answer, you can go back and see the clues that made the ending seem obvious. I've spent my life looking for answers, thinking that there's always a correct way to live my life, that I had to figure out before it happened. However, like when I read mystery novels, I've almost always gotten it wrong. If you asked me 5 years ago what my life would be like, it certainly would be far from my current reality. If you asked me 5 months ago where I would be, it certainly wouldn't be in London. But I wouldn't change a thing. London and this project have made me realize I need to approach my life like a mystery novel. No one truly knows the twists and turns and the answers until they finish that chapter. We can guess, but more often than not, we will be wrong. So, we enjoy life until we come to those answers. And it is only then that we can look back and see the clues. That this ending was so obvious, it seems almost elementary.
Another turning point, a fork stuck in the road. Time grabs you by the wrist, directs you where to go. So make the best of this test and don't ask why. It's not a question but a lesson learned in time. It's something unpredictable, but in the end is right. I hope you had the time of your life. So take the photographs and still frames in your mind, hang it on a shelf in good health and good time. Tattoos and memories and dead skin on trial. For what it's worth, it was worth all the while. It's something unpredictable, but in the end is right. I hope you had the time of your life. It's something unpredictable, but in the end it's right. I hope you had the time of your life. It's something unpredictable, but in the end is right. I hope you had the time of your life.